My husband's mistress sent me photos of their affair to destroy my marriage, so I sent one email in return. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a newsletter from my daughter's school and a promotional offer from a home goods store. The subject line read simply, "You deserve to know." I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm while I answered work emails. My husband had left for his accounting firm an hour earlier, kissing me on the forehead the way he always did, telling me he'd be home late because of a client dinner. I'd nodded without looking up from my laptop, already mentally sorting through my day. The attachment loaded slowly. 3 photos. The first showed my husband, Dominic, sitting at a restaurant booth with a woman I didn't recognize. They weren't touching, but the way they were leaning toward each other suggested an intimacy that made my stomach tighten. The second photo was less ambiguous. The same woman, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her waist. They were standing outside what looked like a hotel entrance. The third photo removed any remaining doubt. They were in bed together, sheets tangled around their bodies, his face clearly visible even in the dim lighting. I stared at the screen for a long time. The coffee grew colder. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere outside, a neighbor started their lawnmower. My first thought, oddly enough, was that the woman was beautiful. Not in a flashy way. She had a quiet prettiness. Brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Minimal makeup. She looked kind. That somehow made it worse. My second thought was that I should be crying, or screaming, or throwing something. Instead, I felt a strange calm settling over me, like the stillness before a storm. I scrolled down to read the message that accompanied the photos. "Mrs. Reyes, I know this must be difficult to see, but I believe you have a right to know who your husband really is. My name is Celeste Vero, and I've been seeing Dominic for the past 8 months. I'm not proud of what I've done, but I can't continue living this lie. He promised me he would leave you, that your marriage was already over in everything but name. I've come to realize those were just words. I'm sending you these photos because I think you deserve the truth. What you do with it is your choice. I'm sorry." I read the message 3 times. Then I closed my laptop, finished my cold coffee, and went upstairs to shower. Dominic and I had been married for 17 years. We'd met at a mutual friend's wedding when I was 26 and he was 28, both of us slightly tipsy and hiding from the DJ's aggressive attempts to get everyone on the dance floor. He'd made me laugh with his dry observations about the other guests. I'd impressed him with my knowledge of obscure Italian wines. By the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers, and by the end of the year, we were engaged. Our marriage hadn't been perfect. No marriage is. But I'd thought it was good. We'd weathered the early years of financial struggle, the heartbreak of 2 miscarriages before our daughter Rosalind was born, the grinding stress of building our careers. We'd learned how to argue without cruelty, and how to forgive without keeping score, or so I'd believed. Looking back now, I could see the signs I'd chosen to ignore, the late nights that had become more frequent over the past year, the way he'd started keeping his phone face down on the table, the business trips that seemed to multiply, the distance that had crept into our conversations. So gradual, I'd attributed it to the natural evolution of a long marriage. I'd told myself that every couple went through phases, that we'd find our way back to each other. That love was a choice we made every day and we were both still choosing. But standing in the shower with hot water streaming down my face, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd known on some level for months. My husband had stopped choosing me. I didn't confront him that night, or the next night, or the night after that. Instead, I began to watch, to listen, to notice. Dominic came home from his client dinner that Tuesday smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, which he blamed on a crowded elevator. He kissed me on the forehead again, asked about my day, helped Rosalind with her algebra homework. He played his role so convincingly that I almost doubted what I'd seen. Almost. I started paying attention to his patterns. The Thursday nights when he worked late, which I now realized aligned suspiciously with nothing on his actual work calendar. I'd found a way to access it through our shared family account months ago when planning a surprise birthday dinner. The weekend mornings when he went to the gym but came home without breaking a sweat. The phone calls he took outside, even in the cold. I watched, and I waited, and I began to plan. The thing about being married to someone for 17 years is that you know where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. Dominic had always handled our finances. I'd let him, happy to outsource that particular stress while I focused on my own work as a medical researcher. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was an accountant. Numbers were his thing, but trust, I was learning, is a kind of blindness. 2 weeks after receiving the photos, I started digging. I requested copies of our tax returns from the past 5 years, which I was entitled to as his spouse. I reviewed our bank statements with new eyes. I traced the credit card charges I'd never bothered to examine before. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Dominic had been siphoning money from our joint accounts for years. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here, a few hundred there, that had grown larger over time. The money moved through a maze of transfers and payments that would have been impossible to follow without dedicated attention. But I am nothing if not dedicated. The trail led to a brokerage account I hadn't known existed, held solely in his name. The balance was substantial, nearly $300,000, accumulated over the past decade. Money that should have been ours, squirreled away for a future that apparently didn't include me. I also found the apartment, a 1-bedroom rental downtown, paid for through a shell company that Dominic had registered under a variant of his name. The lease had started 8 months ago, the same time frame Celeste had mentioned in her email. My husband hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been building an entire parallel life. I met Celeste Vero on a rainy Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after her email had detonated my world. She'd included her phone number in the message, and after much deliberation, I'd texted her asking if we could talk. She'd agreed with surprising eagerness, suggesting a coffee shop in a neighborhood where neither of us would likely be recognized. I spotted her immediately when I walked in. She was sitting at a corner table, hands wrapped around a mug, looking far more nervous than I felt. Up close, she was even prettier than the photos had suggested, younger than me by at least a decade. The kind of woman who probably didn't know yet that life would eventually find ways to break her. "Mrs. Reyes," she said, half rising from her seat. Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure you would. Call me Vivian." I sat down across from her, setting my wet umbrella against the table leg. "And I wasn't sure either. But I have questions, and I think you're the only one who can answer them." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll tell you whatever you want to know. I meant what I said in my email. I'm done with the lies. Why did you send those photos?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Because you deserve to know. I told you." "No." I leaned forward. "I mean, why now? If you've been seeing my husband for 8 months, why suddenly decide to expose him? Why not just end the affair quietly?" Celeste's face crumpled. "Because I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between us. The coffee shop continued its ambient noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of other conversations. But to me, everything seemed to have gone silent. "I told him 2 weeks before I emailed you," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I thought. That he'd be happy? That he'd finally leave you? He'd been promising for months that he was just waiting for the right time." "What did he say?" "He told me to get rid of it." Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. "He said it would ruin everything, that he wasn't ready to blow up his life over a mistake." She laughed bitterly. "That's what he called our baby, a mistake." I sat back in my chair, processing this new part of me wanted to hate this woman, for her youth, her naivety, her complicity in destroying my marriage. But looking at her now, I saw something familiar in her eyes. The dawning realization that the man she'd loved had never really existed. "I'm not going to terminate the pregnancy," Celeste said firmly. "I've made a lot of bad choices, but this isn't one of them. I just thought you should know who you're married to. What you do with that information is up to you." "What about what you do with it?" I asked. "Are you planning to go public? Demand child support? Sue for paternity?" She shook her head. "I have family money. I can raise this child on my own. I don't want anything from him anymore." She paused. "But I understand if you do." I studied her for a long moment. Then I made a decision that would change everything. "Celeste," I said slowly, "how would you feel about helping me destroy my husband?" The thing about revenge is that most people think about it wrong. They imagine dramatic confrontations, public humiliations, the cathartic release of finally telling someone exactly what you think of them. But true revenge isn't about catharsis. It's about consequences. Dominic had spent years building his careful house of cards, the secret accounts, the hidden apartment, the double life. He'd done it because he believed he was smarter than everyone around him, smarter than the wife who trusted him, smarter than the mistress who believed his promises, smarter than the systems designed to catch people who do exactly what he'd been doing. I was going to prove him wrong. Over the next month, Celeste and I met regularly. We compared notes, shared evidence, built a timeline of Dominic's deception that stretched back further than either of us had realized. She gave me access to their text messages, which she'd saved in anticipation of needing proof someday. I gave her copies of the financial documents that showed how he'd been hiding money from both of us. Together, we painted a comprehensive picture of a man who had never stopped believing he could have everything without paying for any of it. But I wasn't just gathering evidence for a divorce. I was building something more elaborate. My brother-in-law Vincent worked for the IRS. This was information I'd filed away years ago, back when family dinners were still events we attended out of genuine affection rather than obligation. Vincent was married to Dominic's younger sister, Francesca, and the two of them had always been slightly awkward at family gatherings, Vincent too quiet, Francesca too eager to please. I'd felt sorry for them, honestly. They existed in the shadow of Dominic's confident charm, always slightly invisible, but invisible people notice things. And Vincent, I suspected, had noticed quite a lot. I invited him to lunch under the pretense of asking for general tax advice. He was surprised but agreeable, meeting me at a restaurant near his office with the wary curiosity of someone who isn't quite sure what they're walking into. "I need to ask you something," I said after we'd ordered, "and I need you to be honest with me, even if the answer is uncomfortable." Vincent's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Is everything okay, Vivian? Is this about Dominic?" In a way, I took a breath. "How much do you know about my husband's finances?" The silence that followed told me everything. Vincent's face went through several transitions: surprise, discomfort, something that looked almost like relief. "I've had suspicions," he finally admitted. "For years, actually. Some of the things he's mentioned at family dinners, the way he talks about his investments, it hasn't added up. But he's my brother-in-law, and Francesca adores him. I didn't want to, 'cause problems?" He nodded miserably. "I know that sounds cowardly. It sounds human." I reached across the table to touch his hand, "But I think it's time to stop looking the other way, and I could use your help." That lunch lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Vincent had agreed to review the documents I'd gathered, and I had a much clearer picture of just how deep Dominic's financial misconduct went. It wasn't just the secret accounts. It wasn't just the hidden apartment. My husband had been committing tax fraud for over a decade, underreporting income, claiming false deductions, hiding assets in offshore accounts that I hadn't even known existed. The brokerage account I'd found was just the tip of an iceberg that extended far below the surface. Vincent couldn't directly report his own brother-in-law. That would be a conflict of interest that could torpedo any subsequent investigation. But he could point me toward the right people to contact, the right forms to file, the right way to become a whistleblower without getting caught in the legal crossfire. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked as we were leaving. "Once you start this process, there's no going back. It could destroy him." "I know," I said. "That's rather the point." The email I sent was 47 words long. I addressed it to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, the FBI's white-collar crime unit, and the forensic accounting team at Dominic's own firm. I attached the complete dossier of evidence I'd compiled: financial records, text messages, property documents, a timeline of misconduct spanning more than a decade. The subject line was simple: report of tax fraud and financial misconduct. I hit send at 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon while Dominic was at work and our daughter was at swim practice. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and waited for the world to end. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days later. Dominic came home from work early, his face pale, his movements jerky with suppressed agitation. He barely looked at me as he went straight to his home office and closed the door. I heard him on the phone for hours, his voice rising and falling in patterns of anger and fear. At dinner, he was distracted, pushing food around his plate while Rosalind chattered about her upcoming science fair project. I watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "Everything okay at work?" I asked casually. He looked up, something flickering in his eyes. Suspicion? Fear? I couldn't quite tell, before his expression smoothed into practiced neutrality. "Just some client issues. Nothing to worry about." I nodded and returned to my meal, hiding my satisfaction behind a bite of roasted chicken. The next 2 weeks were a study in controlled chaos. Dominic's firm launched an internal investigation, which he dismissed to me as routine compliance stuff. But I knew better. Vincent kept me quietly informed, telling me that the firm had already found enough irregularities to warrant serious concern. Meanwhile, the IRS had opened their own case. The amount of money Dominic had hidden was substantial enough to qualify as criminal tax evasion, not just civil fraud. They were taking their time, building an airtight case before making any moves. Through it all, I played the role of the unsuspecting wife. I asked concerned questions about his stress levels. I suggested he take time off, see a therapist, talk to someone about whatever was weighing on him. I was solicitous and supportive and utterly, perfectly normal. He never suspected a thing. The night before everything fell apart, Dominic came to bed earlier than usual. He lay beside me in the darkness, not touching, his breath shallow and uneven. "Vivian," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." My heart rate increased, but I kept my voice calm. "What is it?" A long pause. I could feel him gathering himself, working up to something. For one wild moment, I thought he might actually confess, that he might finally tell me the truth about Celeste, about the money, about all of it. Instead, he said, "I think I might be in some trouble at work. Some things have come to light that I need you to know that whatever happens, I love you. I've always loved you." I lay there in the darkness, listening to my husband declare his love while knowing exactly how hollow those words were. He wasn't confessing out of guilt or conscience. He was preemptively positioning himself for when the truth came out, trying to secure my loyalty before he needed it. "I love you too," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. He reached over and took my hand. I let him hold it until he fell asleep. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. Dominic had just gotten into his car to drive to work when 2 black SUVs pulled into our driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as federal agents approached his vehicle, badges displayed. Watched as they asked him to step out. Watched as they handcuffed him, read him his rights, and placed him in the back of one of the vehicles. He never looked toward the house. Never looked for me. Maybe he was too shocked. Or maybe, even then, he was calculating his next move, figuring out how to spin this in his favor. I stood at the window until the SUVs drove away. Then I called my lawyer to begin divorce proceedings and my daughter to tell her I was picking her up from school early, that we needed to talk about something important. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and difficult conversations. Dominic's arrest made the local news. Respectable accountant charged with tax evasion, fraud, and a host of related crimes. The firm he'd worked at for 20 years terminated him immediately and issued a public statement distancing themselves from his actions. His clients scrambled to determine how much damage he'd done to their own finances. I gave interviews to reporters, playing the devastated wife who'd had no idea her husband was living a double life. I expressed shock, betrayal, appropriate amounts of anger and grief. I never once mentioned Celeste or the photos or the fact that I'd been the one to light the match that burned it all down. Dominic tried to contact me repeatedly from jail, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening. I saved them all, just in case, but never responded. His family's reaction was more complicated. His parents, both in their 80s, were devastated. His mother called me weeping, asking how this could have happened, and I felt genuinely sorry for her. She'd raised a son she thought she knew, and now she was watching him become a stranger. Francesca, Vincent's wife, was another matter. She showed up at my door 3 days after the arrest, her face blotchy with tears and anger. "You did this," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know how, but I know you did." I stepped aside to let her in. "Would you like some coffee, Francesca?" She stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "Coffee? My brother is in jail, my parents are destroyed, and you're offering me coffee? I'm trying to be civilized." I closed the door behind her. And for what it's worth, I didn't do anything. The IRS received information about Dominic's finances and acted on it. If you want to blame someone, blame your brother for being a criminal. He made mistakes. He stole from me for a decade. My voice was harder now. He hid hundreds of thousands of dollars. He maintained a secret apartment for his mistress. He evaded taxes on a scale that could have landed both of us in prison if I hadn't acted first. I met her eyes steadily. "So yes, Francesca," I reported him, and I would do it again. She left without another word. I didn't expect to hear from her again, and I was right. Vincent, on the other hand, became an unlikely ally. He testified in Dominic's trial, providing expert analysis of the financial records that helped establish the scope of the fraud. His wife divorced him 3 months later, Apparently, family loyalty only extended so far. The divorce was finalized 6 months after Dominic's arrest. Thanks to the evidence I'd gathered and the criminal charges pending against him, I was awarded the majority of our marital assets. The secret brokerage account was clawed back by the IRS to pay his tax debt, but there was enough left in our legitimate accounts to ensure Rosalind and I would be comfortable. The house was mine. The car was mine. The life we'd built over 17 years, what remained of it anyway, was mine. Dominic pleaded guilty to multiple charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He got 7 years in federal prison, which his lawyer apparently considered a victory. I considered it the beginning of a debt he could never fully repay. Celeste had her baby in March. A girl. She named her Margot. We'd stayed in touch throughout everything, our unlikely alliance deepening into something that resembled friendship. I visited her in the hospital the day after the delivery, bringing flowers and a soft pink blanket I'd knitted myself during the long evenings of legal proceedings and self-examination. "She's beautiful," I said, looking down at the tiny face in Celeste's arms. "She looks like him." Celeste's voice was tired but peaceful. "I keep waiting to feel angry about that, but I don't. She's not him. She gets to be her own person." "Yes, she does." Celeste looked up at me. "Vivienne, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Always. Do you regret it? Any of it?" I considered the question carefully. Did I regret reporting my husband to the federal government, knowing it would destroy his career, his reputation, his freedom? Did I regret using the photos his mistress sent me as the starting point for a meticulous investigation that revealed the full scope of his betrayal? Did I regret becoming someone who could sit across from a pregnant woman and ask her to help me destroy the father of her child? No, I said finally. I regret that it was necessary. I regret the years I spent trusting someone who didn't deserve it. I regret that my daughter has to grow up with a father in prison. I met Celeste's eyes. But I don't regret the choice I made. He built his own trap. I just helped him walk into it. Celeste nodded slowly. "I think I understand that." "Good." I smiled at her and reached down to touch the baby's tiny hand, "because I'm hoping you'll let me be a part of this little one's life. Honorary aunt, or godmother, or whatever you want to call it. I know that's probably strange, given everything, but..." "It's not strange," Celeste interrupted. "It's the most normal thing anyone suggested to me in months." I laughed, and after a moment she laughed too. The baby stirred but didn't wake. A year after my email brought down my husband's empire, I was sitting on my patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Rosalind was inside, doing homework, and occasionally singing along to whatever music was playing through her headphones. She'd taken the divorce harder than I'd expected, but better than I'd feared. Teenagers are resilient, and she'd built a support network of friends and counselors who helped her process the complicated feelings that came with having a father in prison. She still visited him occasionally. I didn't discourage it. Whatever Dominic had done to me, he was still her father, and their relationship was theirs to figure out. My phone buzzed with a text from Celeste. A picture of Margot in the ridiculous duck-shaped bath she'd bought on a whim, looking deeply unimpressed with the whole concept of water. I smiled and texted back a string of heart emojis. My mom called a few minutes later, ostensibly to ask about a recipe, but really to check in the way she'd been doing every few days since everything happened. My parents had been supportive throughout, never questioning my choices, never suggesting I should have handled things differently. My dad had simply said, "You did what you had to do," and that had been enough. The evening settled around me like a comfortable blanket. Crickets began their nightly chorus. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and then fell silent. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, the one who'd sat at her kitchen island and opened an email that would change everything. That woman had been a good wife, a good mother, a good person who trusted the people she loved and assumed they would trust her in return. That woman was gone now. In her place was someone harder, warier, more aware of the shadows that lurk in the corners of even the most ordinary life, but also someone stronger, someone who knew what she was capable of when pushed. Celeste had asked if I regretted any of it. I'd told her the truth. I didn't. But what I hadn't said, what I was only now allowing myself to fully acknowledge, was that some part of me was glad it had happened. Not glad for the betrayal or the pain or the complicated mess of emotions that still surfaced when I thought about my marriage, but glad for the way it had forced me to become someone new. Glad for the unlikely friendship that had emerged from the wreckage. Glad for the clarity that came from finally seeing my life without the soft focus filter of comfortable illusions. My husband's mistress had sent me those photos to destroy my marriage. She'd succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. But in the ruins of what had been, I'd found something unexpected, the foundation for what could be. I finished my wine, gathered my things, and went inside to help my daughter with her homework. 2 years later, I received a letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from the Federal Correctional Facility where Dominic was serving his sentence. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the same precise penmanship that had signed our wedding certificate, our daughter's birth announcement, 17 years of birthday cards and anniversary notes. I considered not opening it. The curiosity won. "Vivienne, I've spent a long time thinking about what to say to you. I've written this letter probably 100 times, starting over each time I realized I was making excuses or trying to justify things that can't be justified. So let me just say this. I'm sorry. Not because I got caught or because I'm in prison or because my life fell apart. I'm sorry because I hurt you and you didn't deserve it. You never deserved any of what I put you through. I know you turned me in. It took me a while to figure it out, but I know now that those reports didn't come from nowhere. You found everything, didn't you? The accounts, the apartment, everything. And you decided that the appropriate response was to burn it all down. I want to be angry about that. Part of me still is. But mostly, I'm just impressed. I spent years thinking I was the smart one in our marriage, the one who saw angles and opportunities that other people missed. I never saw you coming. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand why you did what you did, and I don't blame you for it. Take care of Rosalind. Take care of yourself. Dominic. I read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in its envelope. I wasn't sure how I felt. There was no neat emotional category for receiving an apology from a man you'd systematically destroyed. But one line stayed with me. I never saw you coming. No, I thought, you didn't. And that had made all the difference. Life settled into a new normal. I threw myself into my work, earning a promotion that came with a corner office and responsibilities I actually enjoyed. Rosalind graduated high school and went off to college, texting me memes and calling every Sunday to complain about her roommate. Celeste and I continued our strange friendship, meeting for coffee every few weeks, our conversations ranging from serious to silly. Margot grew into a chatty toddler who called me Auntie Viv and demanded to be carried everywhere. She had her father's eyes but her mother's spirit, and I loved her fiercely, without reservation. I dated occasionally but couldn't quite commit to anything serious. The therapist I'd started seeing suggested I had trust issues, which seemed like an understatement of astronomical proportions. We were working on it. My brother called one afternoon to tell me that his wife was pregnant with their first child. I cried on the phone, surprising both of us. I hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying until some of it suddenly lifted. You okay, Viv? He asked, concerned. Yeah, I said, wiping my eyes. I'm just really happy for you. And I was. Happiness had become a stranger to me for a while, but it was learning to visit more often. 3 years after my email, I ran into Vincent at a work conference. He'd remarried, a pediatrician named Wendy who seemed warm and grounded and entirely unlike Francesca. They'd just bought a house together, he told me, and were thinking about adopting a dog. How are you really? He asked when Wendy had wandered off to get more coffee. I'm okay. I smiled at him. Better than okay, actually. It took a while, but I think I'm finally on the other side of it. He nodded. For what it's worth, I never regretted helping you. I know it cost me my marriage and half my family, but he shook his head. What he was doing was wrong, and you deserve to know. Thank you, Vincent, for everything. Just promise me one thing. He met my eyes. If you ever find yourself in a situation like that again, I'll handle it differently? No. He almost smiled. I was going to say you should handle it exactly the same way. Some people don't deserve mercy. I laughed, surprising myself. That's dark, Vincent. That's realistic. He glanced across the room to where Wendy was chatting with another attendee. I've learned that the world rewards people who are willing to do what's necessary. You were willing. That's nothing to be ashamed of. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. Vincent wasn't wrong. I had done what was necessary, and I wasn't ashamed of it. But I also couldn't quite escape the nagging sense that the person I'd become wasn't the person I'd wanted to be. My therapist had a field day with that one. 4 years after the email, Rosalind came home from college for Thanksgiving. She was 20 now, studying psychology, planning to go to graduate school. She looked so much like I had at that age that it sometimes hurt to look at her. The same dark hair, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking about something serious. We were cleaning up after dinner, washing dishes side by side, when she said, Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. She was quiet for a moment, hands still in the soapy water. Did you ever think about forgiving him? I didn't need to ask who she meant. Yes, many times. But you didn't. No, why not? I set down the plate I'd been drying and turned to face her. Because forgiveness, real forgiveness, requires remorse. And your father wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry he got caught. There's a difference. Rosalind nodded slowly. I visited him last month. He's different now. Quieter. More humble, I guess. Prison will do that to a person? He asked about you. Did he? He said he thinks about you every day. That he wishes things had been different. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Do you think people can change? Like, really change? I considered the question carefully. I think people can change their behavior. I'm less convinced they can change who they are at the core. That's pretty cynical. Maybe. I picked up another plate. But it's also honest. Your father hurt a lot of people because he believed he was entitled to more than what he had. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was part of who he is. And I don't think 5 years in prison is enough to fundamentally alter that. Rosalind was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I'm not sure I agree with you. That's okay. You don't have to. But I understand why you feel that way. She reached over and took my hand, and I don't blame you for any of it. I want you to know that. My eyes stung with sudden tears. Thank you, sweetheart. I love you, Mom. I love you too, more than anything. We finished the dishes in companionable silence. 5 years after my email, Dominic was released from prison. I heard about it from Rosalind, who'd gotten a call from his lawyer. He was going to live with his parents for a while, she said. Try to figure out his next steps. He wanted to rebuild his relationship with her. How do you feel about that? I asked. Complicated, she sighed. He's my dad. I can't just pretend he doesn't exist. But I also can't forget what he did. Nobody's asking you to forget. I know, she paused. He wants to meet with you too. Talk things out. Get closure. Whatever that means. I almost laughed. I'm sure he does. You don't have to if you don't want to. I told him that. What do you think I should do? Rosalind considered for a moment. I think you should do whatever feels right to you. You've spent 5 years moving forward. Don't let him pull you backward. My daughter, I thought, had become remarkably wise. I met Dominic at a coffee shop. Different from the one where I'd met Celeste all those years ago, but similar enough that the symmetry wasn't lost on me. He looked older, thinner, The prison pallor hadn't quite faded from his skin, and there was a cautiousness to his movements that hadn't been there before. He'd always moved through the world with confidence, like someone who knew he belonged. Now he seemed uncertain of his place in it. Vivian. He half rose as I approached, then seemed to think better of it and sat back down. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I sat across from him. What do you want, Dominic? Straight to the point. You haven't changed. Neither have you, apparently, if you think flattery will work on me. He flinched. Fair enough. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, not drinking. I wanted to apologize. In person. I know the letter I sent wasn't. I know it wasn't enough. No, it wasn't. I've spent 5 years thinking about what I did. To you, to Celeste, to Rosalind, to everyone. He looked up at me. I don't expect you to believe this, but I'm not that person anymore. Then who are you? He didn't answer immediately. The coffee shop hummed around us. Conversations, clinking cups, the whoosh of the espresso machine. I'm someone who's trying to be better, he finally said. Someone who knows what it's like to lose everything and have only himself to blame. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Vivian. I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, really sorry. Not because I got caught or because I went to prison, because I hurt you, because I took the life we built and destroyed it. I studied him for a long moment. He held my gaze, not flinching, not looking away. Dominic, I said eventually, I believe that you're sorry. I believe that prison changed you in some fundamental way, but I need you to understand something. What? I don't care. His face went blank with shock. What? I don't care if you're sorry. I don't care if you've changed. I don't care what kind of person you are now or what kind of person you want to become. I kept my voice level, measured, the same tone I used in professional presentations when I needed to convey absolute certainty. You spent 17 years lying to me. You stole from me. You betrayed me in ways I'm still discovering. And when your mistress got pregnant, your first response was to tell her to get rid of the baby because it was inconvenient. I know. I'm not finished. I held up a hand. You asked me to meet you because you wanted closure. Fine. Here's your closure. I don't forgive you. I will never forgive you. And that's not because I'm bitter or angry or unable to let go of the past. It's because forgiveness is a gift, and you haven't earned it. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. Swallowed hard. I watched him process what I'd said. Watched the emotions flicker across his face. Hurt. Understanding. Something that might have been acceptance. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. I hope you rebuild your relationship with Rosalind. She deserves a father who shows up for her, even if it's 20 years too late. And I hope you figure out how to be the person you're claiming you want to be. But that's going to happen without me. I'm not part of your redemption story, Dominic. I'm the woman you wronged. I stood up, gathered my things. Goodbye, I said. And I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. 6 years after my email, I met someone. His name was Theo to his friends. And he was nothing like Dominic. Where my ex-husband had been smooth and charming, Theo was awkward and earnest. Where Dominic had always seemed to be performing a version of himself for an audience, Theo was exactly who he appeared to be. We met at Celeste's birthday party, of all places. She'd invited me without mentioning she'd also invited her new colleague from the architecture firm where she'd recently started working. I suspected matchmaking from the start. You must be Vivian, Theo said, extending a hand. Celeste talks about you constantly. Does she? I shot Celeste a look across the room. She smiled innocently and disappeared into the kitchen. Only good things, he added quickly. She says you're the strongest person she knows. That's quite an introduction. Too much? He winced. Sorry, I'm terrible at these things. I always say exactly the wrong thing. I found myself smiling despite my wariness. Actually, I think that might have been exactly the right thing. We talked for 3 hours that night. He told me about his work designing sustainable housing, his obsession with vintage record players, his 2 failed attempts at learning to cook. I told him about my research, my daughter, my complicated divorce from a man currently rebuilding his life post-prison. You turned him in yourself? He said, not judgmental, just curious. I did. That must have taken courage. Or spite. I'm not sure which. He considered this. Maybe both. Maybe spite and courage aren't as different as we think. I realized, with some surprise, that I liked this man. Liked his thoughtfulness, his willingness to sit with complicated emotions rather than trying to fix them. Liked the way he looked at me like I was a puzzle he wanted to understand. Would you like to have dinner sometime? I asked. His face lit up. I would like that very much. 7 years after my email, I stood in a small garden venue, surrounded by friends and family, and married Theodore in a ceremony that couldn't have been more different from my first wedding. Where that wedding had been large and elaborate, 300 guests, a 5-course dinner, a 12-piece band, this one was intimate and simple, 50 people. A local restaurant's private room, a playlist we'd made together on lazy Sunday mornings. Rosalind was my maid of honor. Celeste read a poem about second chances. My mom cried through the whole ceremony. My dad walked me down the aisle and whispered, "You deserve this," before handing me off to Theo. When the officiant asked if there were any objections, I had a brief, irrational flash of fear that Dominic would somehow appear and create a scene. He didn't, of course. He'd sent a card when Rosalind told him about the engagement. Brief, polite, wishing me well. I'd thrown it away without reading it twice. Theo's vows made me laugh. Mine made him cry. We were both beaming as we walked back down the aisle, hands clasped, entering the next chapter of our lives. At the reception, Rosalind raised a glass. "To my mom," she said, "who taught me that you can rebuild anything if you're willing to do the work. And to Theo, who had the good sense to recognize an amazing woman when he met one. May your marriage be as strong as both of you." Later, as we danced to a song I'd loved since college, Theo whispered in my ear, "No regrets?" I thought about the question. Thought about the woman who'd sat at her kitchen island 7 years ago and opened an email that changed everything. Thought about the choices I'd made, the bridges I'd burned, the person I'd become. No regrets, I said. Not anymore. 8 years after my email, I became a grandmother. Rosalind had married her college sweetheart, a quiet engineer named Elliot who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. They'd had a small wedding, nothing like yours and Dad's first one, she'd said with a wry smile, and settled in a suburb about an hour away. The baby came early, 3 weeks before his due date, arriving in a rush of panic and phone calls and a frantic drive to the hospital. I made it in time for the birth, holding Rosalind's hand while she pushed, watching my grandson enter the world squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect. They named him Oliver. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's calm disposition, and I fell in love with him instantly. "You're a grandmother," Theo said that night, his arm around me as we looked at photos on my phone. "How does that feel?" "Old," I said, and incredibly happy. Celeste came to visit the next week, bringing Margot, who was 7 now and deeply interested in everything related to babies. She and Oliver's other grandmother, Elliot's mother, a kind woman named Priscilla, bonded over their shared obsession with knitting baby clothes. "Look at us," Celeste said, watching Margot carefully hold the baby under Rosalind's supervision. "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" "Not me," I admitted. 8 years ago, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. She smiled at me. "That's the thing about destruction. Sometimes what you build from the rubble is better than what was there before." I thought about that for a long time afterward, about destruction and construction, endings and beginnings, about the email I'd sent and everything that had followed. My husband's mistress had sent me photos to destroy my marriage. She'd succeeded, but in doing so, she'd also set in motion a chain of events that led me here, to this moment, surrounded by people I loved, living a life I'd never imagined. One email in return. That's all it had taken. 9 years after my email, Dominic died. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected, at the age of 62. Rosalind called me in tears, and I went to her immediately, holding her while she cried. "I thought I'd have more time," she said, "to figure things out with him, to really forgive him." "Did you need to forgive him?" "I don't know. Maybe not forgive, exactly. But understand? Accept?" She wiped her eyes. "He was trying so hard to be better. These last few years, he really was different." I believed her. From what Rosalind had told me, Dominic had spent his post-prison years quietly, living modestly, volunteering at a financial literacy program for low-income families. It was almost enough to make me revise my opinion of almost. "I'm going to the funeral," Rosalind said. "Will you come with me?" Every instinct told me to say no, but this wasn't about me. It was about my daughter, and she needed. "Of course," I said. The funeral was small. Dominic's parents had both passed a few years earlier, and many of his former friends had distanced themselves after his conviction. Francesca was there, looking older and more tired than I remembered. We nodded at each other but didn't speak. I stood at the back of the chapel and watched the service, feeling strangely hollow. This man had been my husband for 17 years. He'd been my partner, my confidant, the father of my child. Then he'd been my adversary, my enemy, the target of my carefully planned revenge. Now he was just gone. After the service, I found myself standing at the gravesite, alone. Everyone else had left for the reception, but I'd claimed I needed a moment. Theo had understood, squeezing my hand before leaving with Rosalind. I looked at the freshly turned earth and tried to summon some emotion, grief perhaps for the man I'd once loved, or satisfaction for the justice I'd achieved, or even relief that this chapter of my life was finally, truly closed. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. "You were a lot of things, Dominic," I said quietly. "Some of them good, some of them terrible. I spent a long time hating you for what you did. Then I spent a long time trying not to think about you at all." I paused. "But I want you to know something. I don't hate you anymore. I don't forgive you either, but I don't hate you. I'm just done. And I think maybe you were too." I stood there for another moment, then turned and walked away. 10 years after my email, I wrote this all down. I'm not sure why. Maybe because Rosalind asked me to, after Oliver got old enough to start asking questions about his grandmother's complicated past. Maybe because Celeste suggested it would be therapeutic, which was probably her psychology training talking. Maybe because Theo encouraged me to find some way to make sense of everything that had happened. Or maybe because I wanted to remember. Not the pain. I didn't need help with that. But the resilience. The strength I'd found when everything fell apart. The relationships I'd built from the wreckage of the ones I'd lost. My husband's mistress sent me photos of their affair to destroy my marriage, so I sent one email in return. It's a dramatic way to summarize 10 years of my life, but it's also accurate in its way. That email was the moment everything changed. The moment I stopped being a victim and started being an agent of my own fate. Would I do it again? Make the same choice, knowing everything I know now? Yes, without hesitation. Not because I'm proud of what I did. The truth is, there were moments during those long weeks of planning and gathering evidence when I barely recognized myself. I became someone capable of cool calculation, of strategic destruction, of watching my husband's life fall apart and feeling nothing but satisfaction. That person scared me sometimes. Still does. But that person was also necessary. Dominic had built his house of cards on the assumption that the people around him were too trusting, too complacent, too afraid of confrontation to ever challenge him. He needed someone willing to prove him wrong. I was that someone, and I don't regret it. Epilogue. 15 years later. The morning sun streams through the kitchen windows as I make coffee, same as I have for decades now. But the kitchen is different. We renovated it 3 years ago, finally getting the layout I'd always wanted. And the woman making the coffee is different too. I'm 67 years old. My hair has gone silver, and I've finally given up coloring it. My hands have arthritis on cold mornings, and I can't read a restaurant menu without my glasses. But I'm healthy, mostly happy, and surrounded by more love than I ever expected. Theo shuffles in, still half asleep, and wraps his arms around me from behind. Morning, beautiful. Morning, gorgeous. We've been doing this routine for nearly a decade, and it never gets old. Big day today. Oliver's recital is at 3, and Margot is coming for dinner. I pour 2 cups of coffee. Also, Rosalind called. She's pregnant again. Theo's face breaks into a grin. Another grandchild? Another grandchild. I hand him his cup. Life keeps moving forward, doesn't it? He kisses my temple. That's what it's supposed to do. Later, sitting in the school auditorium watching my grandson murder a violin solo with more enthusiasm than skill, I think about all the lives that led to this moment. All the choices, all the consequences, all the paths taken and not taken. My first marriage ended in betrayal and revenge. My second began with honesty, and has only deepened over time. My daughter forgave her father more than I ever could, and she's the better person for it. Celeste became the sister I never had, and her daughter calls me family. None of this would have happened without that email, without the photos that broke my heart, without the decision to stop being a bystander in my own life. So yes, I do it again. All of it. Every painful, complicated, morally ambiguous moment. Because this, the silver hair, the arthritic hands, the music of a grandson's terrible violin playing, the warmth of a good man's love, this is what I built from the rubble. And it's exactly what I wanted.